Okay, picking up where we left off, I'm going to add a light source to my scene. One of the things that you might notice from the last video is I had mentioned that I wanted to get rid of some really heavy veins that were over on this edge over here. And so what I did was I just made a new 3D postcard. I went back and I cleaned up getting rid of some of the really deep, dark, heavy crevices and stuff in the rock. And I made a new postcard out of that picture and I applied it. So it was a little too distracting. It was kind of cool, but it was a little too distracting. So anyway, this is where we are now. And the thing that I need to do now is I need to light the scene so that we're not just using the regular IBL lighting. And it's referred to as image based. And if I were to turn this off, just so you can see over here in my regular layers, if I were to just turn off the image based lighting right there, you can see that that's kind of what it ends up doing, because it adds this sort of generic fill light to light the scene, you know, so that you've got something there. If I were to remove that completely, just the scene sort of goes black. Anyway, so and it's referred to, and we've got this infinite light on as well, right? So we can take off the IBL. So what I want to do is I want to come back over here to my environment, environment, scene, whatever, any of these, it doesn't really matter. And then I'm going to add into that scene, I'm going to add a new light source, and there's a little light bulb down here in the bottom. If I click on it, it'll ask me if I want a point light or spotlight. I think spotlight is pretty clear. It's the one where it puts a spot of light on something and then it creates, you know, pretty raking shadows. Raking means long, dark shadows. Point light is sort of like a light bulb. It's a bulb that would come out of a single source, but it radiates in all directions. And so this light, I could have a point light, but because if you take a look at the rest of the picture, I think there's a pretty heavy light that's kind of coming from a specific direction, kind of coming from the left, you know, back and pointing towards the mountain a little bit, and kind of higher up. So if I were to try to reproduce that light source so that I can cast the shadows properly with this, then what I would want to do is come over here and probably create a spot. I think that the point light won't be strong enough, and it won't have enough of a direction. So whenever we get there and we take a look at that, then you'll notice that I need to get into my move tool so that I can have access to that light that I just created. And you'll see over here in my 3D panel, right there, a spotlight was created. And so if I select the spotlight in the 3D panel and look up here at the properties panel, you'll see that I've got some other things that I can adjust. One is that I can click the color so that if we don't want it to be bright white light, we want it to kind of have a little bit of a color cast, maybe a little bit of a sort of a pale orange color cast so that it's not just cold white, somewhere in there. That might be kind of nice. And it warms it up just a little bit to warmer light. The other thing is that we can adjust the intensity. I'm not going to do that just yet. You can tell it whether or not you want it to cast shadows. I do. And then you can tell it how hard or soft you want those shadows to be. Right, so you can adjust that. There's also a thing called light fall off, which I'll show you kind of what that looks like whenever I adjust the light. It's hard to see right now. And then over here, if you click on this little coordinates button, you can also set your coordinates. So like, for instance, if you have a light in one document and you want to copy the coordinates of that light into another document or something, or you just need to record that. So if you change your coordinates, you can easily go back. Sometimes it's not easy to go back to what you had just by maneuvering manually with these moving tools. So I'm going to zoom out a little bit, and you'll notice that I've got, excuse me, it's moving it along the z-axis. Remember, that's the depth axis. If I click on this button over here, it's the orbit, and so I can sort of orbit this around, and I want to try to have it here. Let me collapse some of these for a moment while we mess around with this scene. And I want to have this kind of so that it's coming like from here, but I think that I need to move it. Let's see, maybe move it so that it's kind of coming up, and then let's not that way. Here, there, we can rotate it a little bit, and then we can also rotate it a little bit this way. Okay, and then if I zoom, oops, wrong way, not zoom, and then it looks like we're having a problem here with this E being captured. So I'm still not in a good spot. I might want to hover until I can get the rotation device on the blue, and then I can rotate it like that so that it's coming a little bit more directly and giving the full range of letters in the mountain. Now, if we zoom in a little bit, I want to also make sure that the outdoor adventures part is getting captured as well. So I might need to pull it in a little bit so that it's a little closer and not too far away. Let's see how that looks. And right now you might look at this and go, wow, that's really bright, but we can make some other adjustments too. So so I think that might be a pretty good light source. And this is tricky. Setting up your lights, I think, is one of the hardest things, to be honest, getting your light sources right. So just play with these adjustments and remember that not only do you have the head in which you can drag and move things on an axis, but you also have, there's this little curved bar underneath the head of the arrow that allows you to hover, and then you can click and rotate it around that particular axis and just kind of mess around. And the worst thing that can happen, honestly, is that you don't like something you've done, and then you come back over here and then you just take your spotlight, and if you want to start over, you can just delete it, or you can just jump back in your history if you haven't gone too far in your history. All right, so let's take a look at our layers, and we'll get our properties open. I'm going to get, actually, I'll get 3D open, but I'm going to undock it like we did before so that I can see where all of this stuff is. And I'm going to undock layers so I can pull it over. And okay. So, oh, the problem with undocking though is that then it covers up my scene. Okay, I went ahead and I docked these other two, the properties and the 3D channel, and let's dock layers there. There we go. So now I've got my light set. I can go ahead and get those things docked again. Now there's this other thing that's called light fall off that you can play with, and the light fall off, if you click on it, you can adjust the inner so that the inner light fall off. Here, let me zoom out a little bit. You can see that there's an inner and that there's an outer fall off, and you can adjust those so that the light, whenever I adjust the inner fall off, it pulls this inner ring up higher so that it sort of lowers the I guess the threshold of where it's going to have as much intensity. And so that actually might be kind of a nice thing to have, is to have the light fall off. But you don't necessarily have to have that. If you want to take it off, you can, but you can also see what it looks like with and without it. All right, I can also intensify the shadows if I want to. Actually, sorry, that's not intensifying, it's making them softer. So I'm gonna turn the softness down. I can also turn the light intensity up. See, that's what happens when it's too bright. But I can turn the light intensity up just a little bit. But you can also just leave it at its natural 100% as well. And then if you wanted to take a look at the coordinates, you can map your coordinates if you need them for any reason. Okay. And if I turn on the image-based light over here in my layers panel, you see that it makes it look a little bit brighter. But generally, whenever you go to render something, you generally want to turn off the IBL lighting, the default IBL lighting. That's not the infinite light, okay? That's not the same thing. You can leave the infinite light there, that's fine. And then if you want to adjust the infinite light, you can click on it, and you can also adjust, you know, like where it's dropping its shadows and stuff. So, for instance, if you look at the way that the light is in this picture, it looks like it's kind of coming, like it might want to drop its shadows like that or something. So now if I click off of it and go back to the scene, that makes this feel much higher up, right, by me doing that change. So I actually don't know that I like that change. Let me go back to my history. There we go. And I changed it back to the default. So you can mess around with this infinite light source as well if you want to. You don't have to, and then you don't have to leave it exactly where it is. But just know that when you do this, you're changing where a lot of these shadows are going to be. So, all right, I'm going to undo that. Okay, and let's get out of here. Let's go back to history, and there we go. Choose something, just click off of it and choose something different. Okay, so something else that I can do too that we haven't really talked about is that I can add regular effects on my layer, my 3D layer. So that's something I think it's helpful to know. You might not think about it because it doesn't seem like the same old thing that you would normally do, but if I click over here my normal layers panel and I choose my 3D object and I go down to effects, I can add all variety of things, but one of the things I might do is like an inner shadow if I want to give it some color, and I might want to choose something maybe that's a little bit lighter so that we've got, it's maybe more in this range so that it kind of fills in more with the rocks. It could be a little darker. Yeah, let's do a little darker, like somewhere down here. And in fact, we can even, yeah, do it darker like that. And then you can change it to, like have it overlay or soft light, linear light. That's really, really, that's crazy bad. Multiply is going to be extremely, dark. Darken is going to be very dark, and so on. But you can go and try to play with a bunch of these just to see what happens and see if any of them actually work very well. Saturation is actually kind of interesting. If I were to take off the preview, you can see that it saturates it, but it doesn't make it too dark, which is nice. And it actually allows it to still have, oh, I can't zoom in, to still have some of the sort of blue-green tones in there, which is kind of an interesting one. The color will literally sort of just add the color. I can also turn down the opacity of this effect, but it's one of the ways in which you can kind of even the playing field a little bit, especially if you have a really bright white light, and you have a lot of intensity. You can adjust some of those things to help you maybe get a little bit better color inside of the object to match whatever's happening in the rest of the scene. All right, but you can do other things besides just that. You could mess around with, like bevel and emboss. I don't know that that's something I actually really want to do since it's actually a 3D object already, right? I don't think it's something that I really need to be monkeying around with. It kind of it's interesting, I guess, but it kind of overdoes my 3D effect, and I'm not exactly sure how it would affect my render whenever I go to render that. So let's just turn that off. Just out of curiosity, though, I haven't actually really messed with this particular thing, but you could if you wanted to. Anyway, you've got all these different things that you can fool around with. Also, if you wanted to do like a gradient overlay, you could do something where, for instance, you kind of bring that in if you want to really bring out the contrast or something, and you want to make this stand out. I mean, I think it's a little bit too heavy. Excuse me. And then you would probably need to make sure that your light source is going to be the same. And then anyway, but you get the idea. Maybe color burns ridiculously dark. That's not dark enough. I don't think any of those actually work all that well. Overlay is actually not too bad. But that's something, if I were to take the preview of it off, it actually gives it a little bit more depth, and it really does feel very much more like the rocks that are in this space. I do still want it to have some more contrast though and stand out a little bit. So the other thing that we could do too is something that may or may not work, something like an outer glow. Yeah, I think it probably won't work because yeah, it's not going to work. It interferes too much with the actual 3D aspects of what's happening. But I wonder, yeah, no, inner glow doesn't work either. Anyway, but you can fool around with some of these things. And then, you could also play around with the stroke as well if you wanted. If you needed to just give it like a little extra bump, like if you gave it like a 1 pixel and then you made the color sort of sample from some dark area that's maybe like that dark area. And it could be on the inside or the center, I guess. Outside, okay. But remember what that stroke it's also being applied to? It's also being applied to the drop shadow that this thing has. Remember, because it actually has a drop shadow on it. So that's also intensifying the shadows as well whenever you make any of these things intense. So anyway, you can mess around with some of these things and see what it looks like with and what it looks like without, and you might end up just deciding that you really liked the way it was originally. But I'm gonna I'll go ahead and leave it here. I'm gonna save because I haven't saved recently, and you can kind of take a look at what we've got. I'm gonna click somewhere that's not in a 3D space, and I think that might actually sort of work for me. It might end up kind of being okay. So let's make some other adjustments as well. I think that the shadow might be a little bit too long and heavy. So I think what I'll do is, and let me explain why I believe that's true. Because of where this top piece is sitting, even though it's technically supposed to be stacked on top of the word spire, I'm going to try to make it look sort of like it's sitting in the grass, right? And so we definitely don't want the shadow play to kind of throw us off and make it look unrealistic. So what I think I'm gonna go back and do is, let's go back to my scene. We will, let's go back to infinite light, and I guess we can leave infinite light alone. Let's go back to spot, and we can adjust the intensity, and we can also soften the shadows so that they're not quite so intense. You can see how that looks. And let me go back here as well, and I will soften these shadows too. Let's see how that ends up looking. I don't know, that's a little bit too soft, that set of shadows. I think what I probably need to do realistically is I probably need to go take some effect off that I did over here. So let's just click off, and I'm going to go back into my effects, and like maybe we don't need the extra stroke, for instance. I think that was really hitting the shadows heavily. I think that the inner shadow was okay. and the gradient overlay was okay. It was that stroke that was so heavy. So maybe if I turn the opacity, oops, let's pick the stroke, there you go. If I turn the opacity of the stroke down significantly, maybe that'll help with the shadow, but it won't make it too heavy. And I can also just see what it looks like without it at all. The stroke with it. And it's actually, yeah, it sort of de-intensifies the shadow whenever it's pulled down in strength. I think that that's okay. All right, so I think I'm a little bit happier maybe with the way that that looks. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and talk really quickly about rendering, because rendering is easy to do, but it just takes forever. Okay, and so if you want to see how this would look in a rendered format, you can see how the lighting would be applied to this, and it'll change the appearance a little bit. You can go ahead and render it. It doesn't mean that you're not going to come back and change something, but just be aware that any single little monkey change that you make is going to essentially strip your render quality out, and it's going to make you re-render it. So rendering is really something, because it's so time intensive, that you should do right before you're ready to be done. Okay, it should be like the last thing you do before you save and close for the final time, pretty much. But I'm going to show you how you can do this rendering. And you're just going to be rendering the 3D objects. You're not like rendering everything. I mean, it'll render the whole scene, and so that's why even if I go back and I change this rock face, or I change these curves or something, it will make me re-render. But I am actually choosing the 3D object to render that scene. So let's go ahead and click on that, and I can right click over here and I could say render 3D layer. It's available that way. You can also go up to 3D menu, and you can say render 3D layer here, and so on and so on. Okay, so let's just go ahead and pick that, and then it'll show you down here. If you click, it will show you the progress, and you'll see that it starts popping up with all these like blue areas on the screen. Okay, and it might take a second for this to show you, but down here you should get a render progress. Mine is just being very stubborn and slow. This is extremely processor intensive, so be aware that it's going to take a while. Like this render might take 15 minutes. I don't know. So that means that you need to make sure that before you start a render, you need to be able to plan to stay wherever you are for quite a while. And the slower the computer is, the longer it's going to take to render. Okay, so go ahead and render this, and I'm going to pause, and I'll show you what it looks like when it's done. Oh, and it's finally showing it. It's showing that it's going to take about 17 minutes. Okay, so I'll come back in 17 minutes and show you what it looked like. Okay, so I finished my render, and I actually did a first render, and my lighting was pretty bright, and so I needed to go back and make some adjustments. So I made some simple adjustments. Let's just switch back over real quick to the 3D workspace. And the adjustments that I made were that I actually increased I made some changes here, as you would see, to my inner shadow, and as well, I think, to my gradient overlay. I think I had it increased a little bit, and I also went into my spotlight and my infinite light, and I decreased the intensity. Okay, so those three changes got me to this place with my render. Now, the next thing that you would do is you wouldn't want to make any changes at this point, otherwise it'll sort of undo everything you did in your render. But you can definitely see how the lighting affects also the background. It's not quite as contrasty. It doesn't have as much brightness as it did before, but that's okay. We can kind of fix that in the other version that we're going to do. So go ahead and go up to here to File. You're going to go to Export, and you're going to go to Export As, and then you want to export to your exports or your output folder the PNG or something. I would choose PNG as opposed to JPEG, just because it has it doesn't have the same kind of compression, and it doesn't end up with the same kind of artifacts. So go ahead and export that. I already did it. And then what you can do is you can take a look here and see that that's in fact the export. All right. Okay, and so if I wanted to open this in Photoshop, then I could actually start to make some manipulations where these things are interactive a little bit more. And let me just show you really quickly a file that I have going. So this file is one that I started, and for the sake of time, you know, I'm not going to show you all of the things that I necessarily have already kind of shown you how to do in terms of using reparation tools. You can watch the other tutorials and stuff too, the other assignments, to see how to use some of those tools better if you don't feel completely confident. But I do want to show you at least some of my thinking. And so one of the things is if I turn this top layer off, you see it's called flattened. This is actually how my work started. Actually, if you want to look at the way it really started, it started off looking like that. That was my original. And so the first step that I took is I said, okay, well, I'm going to make a duplicate background copy, which is this one. Okay, so I went ahead and I made this background copy, and I turned off the visibility of this background, and I like to keep my original background whenever I'm working with stuff like this, just in case. Okay, and then the next thing that I went ahead and I did is I created an adjustment layer. All right, and this adjustment layer is a brightness contrast, because one of the things that I lost whenever I got rid of that image-based light in my 3D file, my 3D PSD file, is that it made the rest of this picture sort of darkened. And but what it did also though is it helped with the contrast of this Spire logo, this 3D logo, when I turned off the image-based light. So it's easy enough for me to go back and create a quick adjustment layer. Let me just show you how I did it. I'll click on this real quick, and I can show you what the channel looks like. And if I turn this on, you can see that what I did was I essentially made a selection of this Spire logo because it was already so bright. And then what I did was I actually came into the channel to adjust it, and I used my paintbrush inside of here. And if I have the white selected with my paintbrush, then that means that I can erase, and I turn down the opacity so that I could kind of come in some of these places and erase a little bit, right, like in here, so that it was like really sort of soft and erasing some of this so that it wasn't just like a really harsh, you know, on and off, right? So, and also it allowed me to do it pretty quickly. And then the other thing too I noticed when I was looking at it is like the beginning of the word outdoor and the end of the word adventures were kind of dark. And so what I did was I allowed some of the brightness and contrast that I added to affect the ends of those words by erasing some of this mask area, right? So, so if I turn that back off, you can see that in fact it's affecting this. So if I show you without, right, and then it did the brightness contrast change in all these other areas. All right, and so and the amount that I ended up changing it as I turn the brightness up and the contrast up. All right. So that was the second thing I did. Then the next thing that I did was I decided, hey, you know, I want to see if I can make this look like it's really sitting in this clover. And so I started by creating an extra layer here, like this layer right here that allowed me to come in and use some blending tools and things that allow me to do non-destructive changes. And then there were some things that I just felt like I couldn't do without just copying and pasting selections. So I took selections, let me blow this up a little bit. So I took selections using my quick selection tool that could, like, you know, grab, let's do this, that could grab sort of like these wily selections, right? And I just used the copy and then paste command, and then by doing so, it pasted it into a new layer. And then I could free transform and I could erase parts of it. And so that's what this is, that's what this is, all right? And I had actually copied from out here, right? If you can see where my mouse is moving out here, and then I pasted it in this area and used free transform to make it look like it was sitting in that clover, okay? And so that's what I did. And then I felt like because of the way that this was stacked up, it was just sort of marching up the hill a little bit. And part of the reason that it's doing that is because, you know, if I didn't have all of these things to make it look like it was sitting in the grass, well then in a 3D space, if I were to turn it and look at it straight on, it would be perfectly aligned in the center, right? The mountain to the word spire to the words outdoor adventure. But because of the way that I wanted it to look like it was sitting in the grass, now it looks like it's kind of stacked up the hill in a strange way, because of the way that the perspective is. So what I kind of wanted to do is make it so that the mountain was moved over a little bit. And I think that for my perspective, it makes the logo actually look a little bit more like the logo. And so what I did was I put everything in a group. Okay, so here's my group. And then I duplicated that group, and then I flattened everything, all right? I just merged all the layers, and I got this. And then I used the content aware move tool, and I did it with the move selected with a high color sample. I literally just outlined it as a simple selection, and then I just drug it over and I moved it. And I actually feel like that's a little bit more compact. And the thing is that if I want to put like a person climbing up the hill or climbing up the logo, then I think that this is also potentially going to work a little bit better for me too. All right, so this is a good place to kind of stop. And this would be, you know, adequate for you, you know, in terms of your integration. But if you wanted, there's one more part of the video if you want to see how you could sort of go the extra mile and do something potentially even more fun and exciting. And I can show you how to add the little person climbing up the hill.